So, Ian, the subject of today's program is what is full employment?
That's right. And um, I think the important thing about it, everyone always discusses what full employment is, um, with by just defining what some acceptable level of unemployment is. So we had Bill Shorten recently from the Australian Labor Party saying, "Oh, it's 5%." Quite as if he knew. Like as if that was he he had this idea that it was 5%. I don't know where he got it from, but
Hmm.
that's always the discussion. What is the acceptable level of unemployment that defines full employment?
Yes, fair enough. And then because we had full employment after World War II, didn't we? Starting with Curtin, on to Chifley, and it didn't really stop until after I think Whitlam, was undone in the 70s, and then we've had this other how do you call it? I don't know how to describe what we're experiencing at the moment, but it's not full employment.
No, it's definitely not full employment. In fact, what's less important than the percentage of unemployment that defines full employment is the experience of the unemployed, because it's the experience of people who are unemployed that we should actually care about. And the Australian Employment Party says that what we should aim for is 0% involuntary unemployment, meaning that if you want to work but you can't get a job, the government should guarantee you a job and that job should pay a socially inclusive minimum wage.
Because there are many, many useful things people can be doing, aren't there?
There are, and historically we had a full employment policy in this country after the war. As you mentioned, it was disassembled, and what we've had since then is that unemployment is used as a tool deliberately by the government as a means of controlling inflation. And that people talk about the non accelerating inflationary rate of unemployment, or the NAIRU, and it's this mystical number of percentage unemployment that if it's supposed to be, if you go below that, then you will get crazy out of control inflation. The full employment policy that we had after World War II could be described as Keynesian. It was heavily influenced by full employment during the war, where everyone was mobilised towards the war effort, and it had a
Yep.
lot to do with basically just government just spending. Um, Now, the problem with that methodology, it worked. I mean, to an extent, unemployment was very low during that period, but it still wasn't as efficient as it could have been. So the only way, really, to get full employment without inflation. Now, it's because it is true that if you have the government competing with the private sector for labour, then the wages will spiral out of control and it'll bid itself up. So the only real way to get full employment without inflation, or without a wage price inflation spiral, is through what modern monetary theorists call a job guarantee.
Okay, now the thing about Keynesian economics, and we're not really talking about Keynesian economics here, we're just talking about the natural cycle. It seems to me that the government, from what we're talking about, the government has a role to fill in the natural cycle, the sine curve of boom and bust, so that the government can be there to pick up the pieces a bit and then inject money into employing people so that they can sustain themselves between the boom and bust. And then when that bust finishes, then people will be offered employment from the boom, from what the boom springs, what the boom offers. Is that an accurate sort of appraisal?
Yeah, that's right. And what modern monetary theorists say is that the private sector spends pro-cyclically. And what that means is that when everything's going up, the private sector piles on and everyone wants to go up with it. And as soon as they get spooked,
Sure.
there's a bust. And we mentioned this in the Deficit to Good episode. And the whole point is that the government needs to increase its spending counter-cyclically. When the
Counter
private sector
cyclically.
is
Yep.
when the private sector is declining, the government needs to increase spending. Now, there are two ways to do this. One is the kind of Keynesian pump priming. That's what they call it. It increases demand in the economy by just sort of injecting money. And some people say, oh, well, that's all well and good in a downturn, but then you have to take your foot off the accelerator. And the problem with that is that it's sort of, it doesn't produce full employment without inflation or excessive inflation. And it's also a difficult policy that you have to kind of decide upon on a case by case basis. So you have to have this sort of war room where everyone's trying to decide what we should do. The job guarantee sets a minimum wages and minimum set of conditions that the private sector must exceed before people will go back to private sector employment. So what modern monetary theorists call it is a buffer stock. You've got a buffer stock of people who are ready to work when the private sector picks up. Now, you can either keep that buffer stock employed or unemployed. Now, if you've got an army and it's peacetime, do you let your soldiers sit around and just like eat and watch TV? No, you keep them fit. You got to keep people in the habit of employment. Otherwise, when the opportunity comes for them to get employment again in the private sector, they're not going to be ready to get back into the office. So the job guarantee, that's one benefit of the job guarantee, that it is an employed buffer stock of people who are ready and willing to work. The other advantage is that it works automatically. So you set up the program, when the private sector declines, automatically the private sector will shed labour. They'll walk over to their job guarantee office and get a job. You don't have to make any decisions about it. There doesn't have to be any policy meetings or, when are we going to do this or whatever. It just works automatically. People either come to the job guarantee or leave. And the only decision you have to make is what is the minimum set of wages and conditions that is socially inclusive, but that will not compete with the private sector.
It just sounds like a lot smarter system than we're working in at the moment, this punitive system that enormous numbers of people are suffering under and through. We don't. There must be a better way. There must be a better way. And of course, there are better jobs to be had, aren't there? There's so many volunteer work that's being done at the moment that's somewhat underappreciated, so much so that, for instance, locally, we have a local gallery. They have an enormous number of enthusiastic volunteers, and they're treated like second-rate employees. Do you know that
exactly,
they're supposed to, they get paid nothing, but they're supposed to take orders, be told what that and fit with all the usual requirements of an employee, but with no dignity and no thanks, and it's not a healthy thing. So anyway, we were going to talk about the number of different jobs. Is that right? Is this a good time to talk about it?
Yeah, I think so, because that's one of the first things that people sort of. The first reactions that I get from people when I talk about a job guarantee is, it's just going to be digging ditches, and this is just work for the dole. You're a conservative. You're a wolf in sheep's clothing. You're really a conservative. You just want to. Now, I just want to make it clear, it's not work for the dole, because it is completely voluntary. So people say, so that's great, because then that replaces welfare. I don't want to replace welfare with it, because voluntary unemployment. The economic impact of voluntary unemployment is not even big enough to be a rounding error. People want to work. And if they don't want to work, give them some time and then they'll want to work. Maybe they want to bum around for a few years and they'll come back and they'll work and they'll be productive. But let the baby have its bottle. I don't want to go out and punish people into working, because it's not a productive thing to do.
And we're talking about examples, land care, bush rejuvenation, healing, the child care, aged care, social work, rural fire service, state and emergency service. They're all volunteer work at the moment, aren't they?
All the stuff you just said, that it's already volunteer work that's being done, and those people could have their volunteer work recognised formally with a socially inclusive wage for doing that work. Another one is people who are at home caring for their aged parents or aged relatives, or people caring, full-time carers of disabled people. They get a pittance, and it's such a hard job, and their lives are really hard, and the government could pay them much more for doing that work. And in addition to that, we could across the board increase wages for hospitals, nurses, for fire personnel, for police. All of those vital social roles.
But it could be
could be
managed
increased.
intelligently, couldn't it? It could be managed intelligently to include social decisions from local areas, people who are deciding what are the best projects, how to best manage it. It doesn't need to be a negative process at all. Even though, like you get this work for the dole thing, it really does sound like a very punitive thing. It's not very upbeat, so we're not talking that. We're talking about something that actually transforms the whole nature of or the way government interacts with the population. Would that be correct?
Yes, and the most important thing is it produces full employment, which maintains demand in the economy. Which means that every recovery is faster, that every recovery is more equal. More of the
Yep.
recovery goes to the bottom end of the economic spectrum. You never have people in a position where they're involuntarily unemployed, which creates lifetime damage. It damages
Mm.
families, it damages communities, it produces cycles of poverty, out of which it is almost impossible for some people to escape. And those are
Yes.
all the result of having an unemployed buffer stock of labour during a private sector downturn. So all we're saying is employ people during a private sector downturn intelligently, so that the public sector does not compete with the private sector, but it provides a useful, socially inclusive job, not digging ditches, not some stupid busy work, but really useful, inspiring, socially inclusive roles at a socially inclusive minimum wage and set of conditions that the private sector must exceed before it can lure people away from that in the next upturn.
And you mentioned an Argentinian example before, the EFS program. Is that right?
Jefes, yeah, it's
Jefes.
Jefes,
Oh yes, there
and
we go.
they had that's the example, really the only example that gets really close to being a pure modern monetary theory designed job guarantee. There are a couple of quirks about that program that meant that it wasn't purely compliant with the way that a modern monetary theorist would design it. Even so, it was very, very effective, and everyone
Mm.
can look that one up. Jefes. There's a lot written about it.
Yep.
I forget her name is. It's Pashmina Chiverica or something. I can't pronounce her name. She's a modern monetary theory economist. She has talked about that, and she did a paper with Randall Ray on that as well. So that's the closest thing we've had in modern times to a job guarantee, and
Yep.
it's a really good example of what you can achieve with a well designed government employment program.
Because the thing about this, and this is the most sanguine, most optimistic part of all this, is that instead of everybody living in fear of a bust, you can actually, it's just like a change of lifestyle where you decide, okay, well, I've got an artistic lean, and I can contribute to my society, my region, in through with these skills that previously I was struggling with. I've always struggled with. Artists, starving artists everywhere. They can do all these things, and then various how would you call it? It's just a how would you call it? It's just like the El Nino, La Nina cycle, where
Yeah.
it's like a weather cycle. You just accept it. There's not going to be much rain. Okay, don't use so much water, but like there's lots of sunny days. So it's just a part of life. And so the boom bust cycles of our social democracy, which is really just a society that embraces capitalism. A lot of people don't understand that. It's just a
Yeah.
society that embraces capitalism. It's as simple as that. It's not Reds under the bed. It's not totalitarian. It's just you not living in fear of living on the streets.
Yeah, exactly. And it's that whole thing about arts and culture. We all consume music and art and music is such an important part of our society. And there's people out there who are doing it already, but not
Mm.
being paid a socially inclusive wage to do it. And that's another area that the government could dramatically increase spending in without inflation risk. So it's all about the government has to look for ways that it can spend into the economy that will
Yep.
improve equality, improve income inequality that will
Yep.
offset the effects of the business cycle, but that won't cause inflation. And there are a million ways to do it.
Well,
So the
and
take home
so,
message is it doesn't have to just be digging ditches and cracking rocks and
no, no,
punitive. It's not punishment.
it's not.
It's
It's
not
not Cool
punishment.
Hand Luke.
It's right. Yeah, it's
It's
not
not
cool hand
cool.
Luke.
It's not Cool Hand Luke. You're not digging ditches and filling them in again.
Right, exactly. It's this.
Yeah.
We're
Hey,
better
listen.
than that.
One thing I wanted to interrupt you with, Ian. I like interrupting you. Is that when what you're talking about is inflation in regards to MMT. Most people will, when they get the slightest understanding of MMT, they say, "Oh, that's just going to be inflationary." But you're saying that inflation is absolutely a priority to modern monetary theorists.
Oh yeah. So every modern monetary theorist will always say we need full employment and price stability. Those two things always go together. So there's not a sense that modern monetary theorists do not disregard inflation. In fact, inflation is the most important thing to control next to employment. We need to make sure that we have price stability. But first of all, we fear inflation too much. Even low double digit inflation is manageable. It's not ideal, and people find it uncomfortable. But we stress about 3% inflation, whatever, way too much. But a job guarantee produces full employment with price stability. So you can keep low single digit inflation, 2, 3, 4% inflation, with full employment using a job guarantee. And the only reason that you would say 2 or 3% inflation rather than 1 is that a little bit of inflation is way, way, way better than deflation. So deflation is horrible.
Deflation. It's what happened
2%.
to Japan. Yeah.
Yeah, so
Now
two
we've
percent,
only
three
got
percent
we've
inflation
got
is a good buffer because you really don't want deflation.
no. So we've only got a minute left. Okay, how are we going to finish?
Well, I'd just like to say that the take-home message here is that a job guarantee is all about full employment and price stability. That it's not about punishment. It doesn't replace welfare. It's not work for the dole. It sets the minimum wage at a socially inclusive rate and sets a minimum set of conditions that the private sector must exceed before it can lure people back into employment when the economy
And it's
starts to pick up again.
counter-cyclical.
It's
It's
counter-cyclical, and
counter-cyclical.
it's an automatic stabilizer that enables the government deficit to increase to exactly the right amount in order to offset the business cycle.
Right. It's not Disneyland. It's a solution.
It is not Disneyland.
How's that?
It's
It's
good.
not Disneyland. A lot of people don't think, they think we're talking pie in the sky. It's not pie in the sky. It's just dealing with a long-term problem that we don't look at because we're in these very, very short-term cycles. Look how, we've only got 3-year government cycles, so people can barely look past that. So, but anyway, look, it's been
And
great.
I guess actually,
Over
you
to
know
you to
what?
finish.
I'm gonna say one more thing. One more thing that
Mm,
I'm gonna say is we had this policy in this country, and during the time that we had this policy, we had an unprecedented level of prosperity that has not
mm,
been seen before or since. And people talk
mm.
about the boom years and the golden age and the decline of whatever, and society's falling apart. It is not because the young people are worse than the old people, right?
No,
There is no
no.
moral decline. All there is
Mm,
increasing unemployment. So
mm.
we can get back there again.
With a practical solution.
Indeed. All right. Thanks,
Okay.
Tim. Next week we're going to do an introduction to the Australian Employment Party, who we are and what we're all about, and some of the non-economic policies.
Wonderful. All right. I'm glad we've managed to sum it up so briefly. Thanks again, Ian.
Okay. Thanks, Tim. I'll see you next week.
You too.